What happens when Hollywood's most legendary tough guy walks into a den of daytime television hosts who think they can push him around? Well, you're about to find out. And trust me, this is one confrontation you won't see coming. Clint Eastwood, the man who built a 6-decade career on quiet intimidation, razor-sharp stares, and a calm authority that could silence a room, wasn't just another celebrity guest that morning. He was Hollywood royalty, a living embodiment of grit, resolve, and the kind of stoic masculinity that generations of moviegoers had grown up idolizing. From the dusty plains of the good, the bad, and the ugly to the raw streets of Gran Torino, Eastwood's screen presence had always been larger than life. But today he wasn't standing on a film set surrounded by stunt coordinators and lighting crews. He was sitting on the brightly lit stage of The View, surrounded by outspoken co-hosts who made their careers not with six-shooters and squints, but with fiery opinions and sharp tongues. The show began like any other episode, a cheerful crowd, lively music, and the hosts exchanging light banter as the cameras panned across their smiling faces. Joy Behar, known for her no-filter commentary and sarcastic humor, leaned toward Whoopi Goldberg, whispering something that made the audience chuckle. Sonny Hostin and Sarah Haynes glanced at the cue cards preparing their talking points. It was all routine, until the producers announced the next guest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whoopi said, her trademark grin widening as the applause swelled, "please welcome the legendary Clint Eastwood." The crowd erupted. Even those who weren't die-hard fans of classic cinema couldn't help but feel a spark of awe. This wasn't just a movie star walking in. This was a man who had become a symbol of an era, a symbol of strength, stoicism, and old-school honor. Clint stepped onto the stage with the calm confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. His movements were deliberate, measured. His eyes scanned the room not with arrogance but with quiet control. Dressed simply, dark jeans, a weathered leather jacket, and that familiar squint that could turn any line into a quote. He greeted the host with a nod and a soft, gravelly, "Thank you for having me." The applause faded, and Whoopi started the conversation on a warm note. "Clint, it's so great to have you here," she said, her tone respectful. "Tell us about your latest project. What drew you to this particular story?" Eastwood leaned back slightly, hands resting on the armrests of his chair, his voice carrying that calm, unmistakable drawl. "Well," he began, "it's about second chances, about people who've made mistakes but still find a way to make things right." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "I think we live in a world where everyone's quick to judge, quick to cancel, quick to move on. But redemption, that's something we've forgotten about. This film, it's about remembering that no one's past defines their entire story." Whoopi nodded, intrigued. The audience listened attentively. It was the kind of reflective statement that reminded everyone why Eastwood wasn't just an actor or director. He was a philosopher of the human condition. But as the conversation flowed, the tone shifted. Joy Behar, never one to stay quiet for long, jumped in. "Clint, I have to ask," she said, her voice laced with that familiar sharpness. "You've been very open about your conservative views over the years. Don't you think some of your old-school ideas about morality or justice might be outdated, especially in today's society?" The crowd reacted, a mix of gasps, chuckles, and scattered applause. The tension in the room thickened. Whoopi's eyes darted toward Joy, a subtle warning in her expression, but it was too late. The question was out there, hanging in the air. Clint didn't flinch. He didn't lean forward or raise his voice. He simply turned his gaze toward Joy, that same cold, unblinking stare that had sent countless on-screen villains running for cover. "Outdated?" he repeated softly. "Ma'am, I've seen a lot of new ideas come and go. Most of them don't last long enough to matter." The studio fell silent. Even Joy, for once, hesitated. Clint continued, his voice low but firm. "Morality doesn't get outdated. Integrity doesn't have an expiration date. You can dress it up, you can rebrand it, you can hashtag it, but at the end of the day, right is still right and wrong is still wrong." The audience erupted in applause. Some stood. Joy forced a smile, trying to pivot. "Well, that's one way to look at it," she said, laughing nervously. "I just think the world's changed a bit since Dirty Harry." Eastwood gave a small shrug. "Maybe," he said, "but people haven't. We still want justice. We still want to be treated fair. We still want to believe that doing the right thing counts for something." The world can change all at once, human nature doesn't. Whoopi quickly jumped in to steer the discussion back toward the film, but the moment had already become something else, something electric. Clint had drawn a line, not in anger but in conviction. His words carried the quiet force of a man who had lived long enough to see both sides of history and still believed in timeless truths. For the next few minutes, the hosts tried to recover, peppering him with safer questions about directing and storytelling. Clint answered each one with grace and precision, but the undercurrent of that earlier exchange lingered. The audience could feel it, a clash between eras, between Hollywood's old guard and the talk show culture of soundbites and social politics. By the time the segment wrapped up, the tension had eased, replaced by a mutual respect. Even Joy, despite her earlier jab, extended her hand. Clint shook it, smiling faintly. "You're tough," he said. "I like that," she laughed. "Well, I had to be. You're Clint Eastwood." The crowd laughed too, and just like that, the storm had passed. But online, the moment was already catching fire. Clips of the exchange flooded social media. Headlines calling it Clint Eastwood's epic showdown on The View. Viewers debated who was right, who crossed the line, and whether the old cowboy still had it in him. And if you watched closely, you'd realize something powerful. Clint Eastwood hadn't raised his voice, hadn't insulted anyone, hadn't stormed off the set. He had done what he'd always done best, stood his ground, spoken his truth, and reminded everyone that sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one who leaves the biggest impression. Because when a legend walks into a room full of talkers, he doesn't have to shout. He just has to speak, and the world listens. The studio lights glimmered brightly, casting a soft golden glow over the set of The View. The audience sat spellbound, leaning in as Clint Eastwood, the living embodiment of old Hollywood grit, spoke with quiet conviction. "Sometimes," he said, his gravelly voice steady and deliberate, "people deserve another shot at redemption, even when society's already written them off." There was a pause, the kind that hung heavy in the air, filled with the echo of something genuine. Sarah Haynes leaned forward, visibly moved by his words. "That's such a beautiful theme, Clint," she said warmly. "How do you choose which stories to tell at this stage in your incredible career?" Clint gave a small nod, considering his answer carefully. "I look for truth," he said simply. "Stories that say something real about the human condition. Hollywood's got enough fantasy. I'm more interested in what's real, what hurts, what heals." The sincerity in his tone resonated with everyone in the room. The crowd murmured softly in appreciation. The conversation flowed effortlessly for the next several minutes, a rare kind of dialogue where substance took precedence over spectacle. Eastwood spoke about his approach to directing, the importance of silence in storytelling, and the lessons he'd learned working with actors over the decades. Each sentence carried the weight of experience, the wisdom of a man who had lived through every era of Hollywood and come out the other side with his integrity intact. The hosts listened intently. Whoopi Goldberg nodded thoughtfully at each response. Sonny Hostin smiled, occasionally jotting down notes. Even the audience seemed to hang on every word as if taking part in something historic. Clint Eastwood wasn't just promoting a film. He was offering a masterclass in artistry and humility. But one person at the table had been unusually quiet. Joy Behar sat back in her chair, arms crossed loosely, a faint smirk playing on her lips. Her eyes gleamed with the kind of anticipation that could only mean one thing. She was waiting. Waiting for the perfect moment to stir the pot. Finally, she leaned forward, her tone sweet but loaded. "Clint," she began, "can I ask you something?" Whoopi shot her a subtle, cautious glance. It was the kind of look that said, "Joy, not now." But Joy ignored it. "You talk a lot about truth and redemption," she continued, her smile tight and deliberate. "But don't you think some of your past comments, and, well, certain political endorsements, might contradict that message?" A wave of discomfort swept through the studio. You could practically feel the air chill. The audience shifted in their seats. Producers behind the cameras exchanged anxious glances. Clint didn't move at first. His eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger, but in the same quiet, measured way that had made entire movie theaters hold their breath. "Which comments would those be, Joy?" he asked evenly. Joy's voice took on that trademark mock-innocent lilt. "Oh, you know," she said with exaggerated sweetness. Your support for politicians who shall remain nameless but who've made some questionable statements about women and minorities. There was an audible gasp from the audience. Whoopi visibly winced. Clint's expression didn't change. He looked at her, calm, collected, immovable. When he finally spoke, his words came out slow, deliberate, and edged with unmistakable firmness. I don't recall making any statements that disparaged women or minorities, he said. And if you're suggesting that I have, I'd like to see you back that up. Joy blinked, momentarily thrown off, but quickly recovered. Well, maybe not directly, she pressed on. But by association, Clint. You've publicly supported certain people whose rhetoric has been, let's just say, controversial. Don't you think that sends a message? The tension thickened. The other hosts exchanged uneasy glances. Sunny looked down at her notes. Whoopi exhaled quietly, realizing there was no way to reel this back now. The interview had veered off course, and fast. Clint leaned back slowly, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp as a knife's edge. When he spoke again, his tone was cool, almost chilling in its composure. Young lady, he began, the words carrying both authority and restraint. I've been in this business since before you were born. I've worked with people of every background, every belief system, every political persuasion, and I've always judged them the same way, by their character, not their party affiliation. The audience burst into spontaneous applause. Some even cheered. Joy's face tightened slightly, but she pressed on, unwilling to back down. Young lady, she repeated, her voice rising an octave. Excuse me, Clint, but I think I have every right to ask tough questions of my guests. Clint didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His response came like a verbal lightning bolt, calm, concise, devastating. And I, he said evenly, have every right not to answer gotcha questions from someone more interested in creating controversy than having a conversation. The audience erupted. The applause thundered louder than before, echoing through the studio. Even Whoopi couldn't help but grin slightly, clearly relieved that someone had managed to turn the tension into poetic justice. Joy sat back, visibly flustered but trying to mask it with a smirk. Well, she said dryly, I guess that's one way to dodge a question. Clint smiled faintly, that classic Eastwood half grin that said more than words ever could. Not dodging, ma'am, he said. Just choosing my battles, and this one isn't worth fighting. For a long moment, the studio fell silent. Then slowly the crowd began to cheer again, not for the drama, but for the clarity, for the unshakable presence of a man who had spent a lifetime standing his ground with grace. Whoopi quickly jumped in, her voice cheerful but steady. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk more about Clint's new film and what inspired it. The music swelled, the camera lights dimmed, and as the segment cut to commercial, Joy looked over at Clint. For the briefest second, their eyes met, and she realized something. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't insulted her, hadn't even lost his cool. He didn't need to. His silence carried more power than any argument she could have made, and when the show returned, the atmosphere had shifted. The tension was gone, replaced by something else, respect. The crowd no longer saw an awkward clash between celebrity and host. They saw a moment of truth. Because that's the thing about Clint Eastwood. On or off camera, he doesn't perform. He just is. And when he speaks, the world listens, whether it wants to or not. The air inside the studio had turned electric, tense enough that you could almost hear the pulse of every person in the room. The crowd, moments earlier, laughing and clapping, now sat frozen, eyes fixed on the unfolding exchange between Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood and Joy Behar. What had started as a simple promotional interview had become something else entirely. A collision of worlds, generations and temperaments. Joy leaned forward, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Don't you think it was a little, unhinged? She asked, her tone somewhere between accusation and mockery. You could hear the faint gasp ripple through the audience. It wasn't just a question, it was a challenge. Clint didn't flinch. He didn't frown or smirk. He simply looked at her, those piercing eyes narrowing just slightly. The kind of look that could stop a villain mid-sentence in one of his old westerns. He leaned forward a fraction, and when he finally spoke, his voice dropped to that signature near whisper. Calm, deliberate, deadly precise. Joy, he said softly, let me ask you something. Joy blinked, momentarily thrown off by his tone. What? she said, her defensiveness already creeping in. How many films have you made? The question hit the air like a slow-spinning coin. The audience shifted. Whoopi Goldberg glanced toward the producers, half amused, half alarmed. What does that have to do with anything? Joy shot back, crossing her arms. Just answer the question, Clint said evenly. How many films have you directed, produced, or starred in? Joy hesitated, her lips pressing together. That's not the point, she said. I'm a television host and a comedian. Clint nodded slowly, almost as if he had expected that exact response. Right, he said quietly. And how many Academy Awards have you won? The audience gasped again, not because of the question itself, but because of the precision behind it. It wasn't arrogance. It was pure, old-fashioned authority, the kind earned, not assumed. Joy's face flushed slightly. Again, she said, her voice rising an octave. That's not relevant to this discussion. Clint leaned back just a little, resting his weathered hands on the armrests. How about this, then? He continued, his voice like slow-burning fire. How many careers have you launched? How many young actors have you given their first break? How many stories have you told that actually meant something to people? Joy opened her mouth, then hesitated. The confidence she wore like armor began to crack piece by piece. I entertain people every day on this show, she said finally. Though it sounded more like a defense than a declaration. Clint tilted his head slightly, that faint, knowing half-smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Do you? He asked quietly, his voice filled not with sarcasm but with genuine curiosity. The silence that followed was deafening. Because from where I'm sitting, he continued, it looks like you ambush guests and try to create controversy for ratings. Is that your idea of entertainment? The audience went still. You could practically feel the oxygen drain from the room. Some of the co-hosts exchanged uneasy glances. Others simply froze. Even the camera operators had stopped moving. The tension wasn't just visible, it was alive, crawling across the studio floor like static. Joy's eyes widened. Excuse me? She said sharply, but the strength behind her voice was wavering now. This is a talk show. We ask questions, tough ones sometimes. Clint nodded again, calm as ever. Then maybe ask the ones that matter, he said. The ones that tell people something they don't already know. That's what conversation is supposed to be. Not a trap, not a headline. For a moment, Joy didn't respond. The silence stretched long enough for the audience to start whispering among themselves. Then, mercifully, Sarah Haynes jumped in, her voice cheerful and desperate to defuse the situation. Clint, she said quickly, your films have entertained millions of people around the world. What's been the most rewarding part of your career? It was a smooth pivot, a lifeline. The audience exhaled collectively, as if grateful for the escape. But Clint wasn't quite done yet. He turned toward Sarah with a faint, polite smile. You know what, Sarah? He said. I'll answer that. He paused for a long beat, just long enough for everyone to listen. The most rewarding part, he said finally, has been working with professionals. People who understand that respect is earned, not demanded. It was surgical, perfectly measured, cutting just deep enough to make its point without ever losing composure. The crowd erupted into applause, louder than before. Some cheered, others laughed nervously, and Joy forced a tight smile, trying to pretend she wasn't the target of that final line. Whoopi Goldberg, ever the veteran moderator, quickly jumped in with a practiced smile. All right, she said, clapping her hands together. We're going to take a short break and come back with more from Clint Eastwood. Don't go anywhere. The music swelled, signaling the commercial break, but the energy in the room was still humming. As the lights dimmed, Clint leaned back in his chair, unfazed, as if he'd just finished a casual chat, instead of dismantling one of the most outspoken hosts on daytime television. Joy looked over at him, still trying to gather her composure. Clint met her gaze briefly, his expression unreadable, calm, collected, unbothered. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply existed in that space of quiet dominance that had defined him his entire life. When the cameras went dark, crew members began to murmur softly. A producer whispered something into Whoopi's earpiece. Sarah let out a nervous laugh. The tension was slowly melting, replaced by awe. Everyone knew they had just witnessed a moment that would be replayed, clipped, and debated across social media for days. Because in that 5-minute exchange, Clint Eastwood had done what few could. He reminded everyone that real power doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to posture or provoke. It just is. And as the segment resumed after the break, the audience could still feel the echo of his presence, a living legend sitting beneath studio lights, completely unshaken, a man who had faced down critics, outlasted generations, and still stood tall. When Clint Eastwood spoke, even the loudest room went silent, and when he finished, you could only think one thing: some men don't age, they ascend.